All right, Zig coming in on the top. Today on the show we have Aaron Lange, author, artist, and co-founder of Stone Church Press. Aaron has just released his first book called Ain't It Fun? Peter Laughner and Proto-Punk in the Secret City. It's a brilliant book with a staggering amount of research and a keen attention to detail in stunning art. It's a graphic novel retelling of the history of Cleveland and the history of Peter Laughner. Now, if you do not know who Peter Laughner is, Peter Laughner was a co-founder of one of the most influential and important bands from Cleveland, Pere Ubu, which started from Rocket of the Tombs. Now, Rocket of the Tombs broke up into two bands, Pere Ubu and the Dead Boys, both of which had an immeasurable impact. None of that being possible without Peter. And sadly, Peter passed away at 24. Aaron does an incredible job of capturing the essence of Cleveland, the essence of Peter, in a wholehearted, well-researched, and exciting package. Now, this is Aaron's first book, and it's 444 pages, right? This is a dense read. It bounces everywhere, and it tips the hat at so much that was going on, both with the punk rock history and the city's history. So, for reoccurring listeners, and new listeners, welcome. I was entranced with Peter's story before doing a bunch of research whilst getting ready to talk to Richard Lloyd from television. So if you're a fan of any of these bands we mentioned during this conversation and want to know different first-hand account stories of Peter, you might want to check out some of these other interviews. A few of those being David Thomas, Richard Lloyd, Adele Bertay, Robert Kidney from the Numbers Band, Chris Butler, and not a first-hand account, but a fan of Peter Laughner, David J. from Bauhaus. So if any of those sound interesting, look in the podcast, my back catalog. Those came out within the last few years. So being well aware of who Peter was, when I saw Aaron's book, I picked it up in Coventry. I was blown away. I'm looking at this thick 444-page graphic novel of Peter's life, and it was super excited and picked it up and blasted through that book. I'm really excited to share this conversation with Aaron, with you guys, but before that, there's one thing I gotta make sure you guys know about, and that is December 17th at the Beachland Ballroom, they're doing a book release. Hosted by John Skirtick from the Cleveland Public Library, it will feature Aaron and his partner at Stone Church Press, Jake Kelly, for some interviews, and then they're going to spin some tunes from Cleveland classic punk rock, and it's going to be a super fun night. And if you guys are not doing anything on the 17th of December, make your way to the Beachland Ballroom. Also, December 9th at the Gronk Shop, Stone Church Press will be vending at the Gronk Shop's Jingle Bell Holiday Shop, where you can catch Aaron there as well at one point. All right, now let's get to this conversation. If you dig what you hear, if you can like, rate, review, subscribe to the podcast and any of the podcast platforms, that helps me keep talking to cool guests like Aaron and sharing their insights with you. Now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Aaron. And I started tracing this line with Peter's story. And like when I saw your book, I'm like, oh my God, this is the thing I was trying to do with people that knew him, but way better done. So I was so stoked to find it, man. But yeah, so I guess the kind of jump into it, how'd you or are you a musician?
I'm not a musician.
Okay. Because like Peter's like story is like, it's very particular, and it's kind of like, it's not easy to find stuff about. And this is a really in-depth, well-researched read. How'd you come across Peter's story then?
Sure. Like I started listening to Pere Ubu when I was like a senior in high school, though I didn't really know Peter's name. Excuse me. I don't think I started to hear Peter's name until Rocket from the Tombs reformed in the early 2000s. And when they, Smogville released all those recordings. And I saw them play in Columbus. I was living down there at the time. And you'd kind of hear Peter's name mentioned in like hushed tones. He was sort of talked about in this kind of like urban legend kind of way. And I'd always had a sort of vague interest in, the Electric Eels and what had gone on in Cleveland. And as the years went by, I just kind of hear more or learn more. And it was always just something I kind of kept in my pocket, is like, oh, this is something I'm interested in. But that kind of just started snowballing, and I got more and more interested And Peter just kind of seems like a nexus point to it all. I don't necessarily argue that he's like was more talented or than anyone else in the scene, but or that he was less. I'm not a musician, like I said, so it's not for me to kind of provide that sort of critical analysis. But Peter was just this kind of he just bopped around so much, and he had so much energy. And he's going up to Detroit to see Lester Bangs and the Cream offices, and he's going over to New York at Max's Kansas City and CBGB's. He lived in Akron for a while, and he just fucking knew everybody.
Yeah,
and just had so many different bands and so many different styles that he lived all over Cleveland, on the east side, on the west side, in the suburbs. That he just, to talk about Peter, he was a very good device for talking about the entire city and the entire kind of underground.
Yeah, definitely. Like, because I didn't I was familiar with some of his bands, but I could not find, I don't even know how you were able to trace that story so clearly, because finding all the stuff I couldn't I read Adele Bertay's book Peter and the Wolves, and of course
that's a great book.
Yeah, of course you get the big bands the Rocket from the Tombs and Pere Ubu, and then the Wolves, and but there was the Cinderella Backstreet, and there's all these bands that are just crumbling, and you know what I mean, and maybe it was how explosive he was in his own kind of self-destruction, but all that sparked so much. And I think the first time I came across his name was I talked with Richard Lloyd, and Peter Laughner came up, and then that whole rabbit trail started for me. And I tried to scratch at the surface, but I could not find I don't know how you got this. Was this all through reading his articles, talking to people? How are you able to put together this history?
Well, yeah, there's kind of a variety of sources. And I tried to be pretty clear about my sources in the end notes. So
you did reading through, I was when you got back to me, I was like, oh man, now I got to really power through this book. And I got to the end notes and I started to read some of those today, and they are very detailed. So I don't want to say that I couldn't follow that. I just didn't get time to dive into that.
Sure. But yeah, so there's some kind of primary documents when it comes to Peter. And I think the original primary document was his ex-wife's essay, Those Were Different Times, which ran in the local fanzine Clee. And that's not just about Peter, but also just kind of mirrors and just kind of just very early what was happening. And then there were various other fanzine articles, and probably the most detailed overview you could find anywhere of the early Cleveland punk scene would be From the Velvets to the Voidoids by Clinton Halen, which talks about Peter and Electric Eels and Mirrors and all that. And it's probably the most thorough writing on the subject, but the book, that said, the book's focus is mostly on New York and what was going on in New York, but the book does peel off and talk about Cleveland, which tells you something, that the book only talks about really Cleveland and New York, because there really wasn't a punk scene happening anywhere else at that time. Now, you could talk about certain bands like Simply Saucer over in Ontario, for example, but they were kind of isolated. And what was going on in Detroit was a little still more rooted in the 60s, like the Stooges and the MC5 and all that. So Clinton's book is a major source. Then there's all the research that the people at Smogvale did, which is not entirely represented in their Peter Laughner box set. Those guys have done other articles and other unpublished things. And, and then just Peter's own writings, because Peter was always peppering in autobiographical details in his own writings, some of which are available in that Smogvale book. Others I found through various archives at Cleveland State University or the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And sometimes it's not even that interesting of an article, or it's not that interesting of a subject, But like I said, Peter he would just throw in weird details. Like, like, oh, this reminded me of seeing David Bowie at Public Hall. And you're like, okay, so he was there. That's good to know.
That's like, you did an incredible job of tracing that story. Like,
so I'll give you another example, because there's little bits and pieces just like everywhere.
Yeah.
So there's a part in the book where there's like a very brief anecdote, like one page, about Bruce Springsteen coming to town,
right?
And Peter Laughner like giving him a ride like around the city, and Springsteen kind of realizes like, oh, this guy's fucking wasted. That comes from a different Clinton Halen book, which I haven't even read, about Bruce Springsteen. It's just a book about Springsteen, and there's one little bit in there about him coming to Cleveland and encountering Peter Laughner. And I think I just stumbled on that page via like a Google search. And I was like, okay, well, here's a cool story. And, if you're looking for information on Peter Laughner, the first place you look would definitely not be a Bruce Springsteen book.
Right.
Some other interesting stuff comes from John Gorman's book. John Gorman ran the Buzzard radio station.
Yeah.
And he tells like the anecdotes about like Peter interacting with Lou Reed. So, a lot of this stuff's out there. It's just very like spread out and very like disparate sources. So I was kind of trying to like aggregate some of that. And then if I was confused or something was like didn't make sense or was contradicted by another statement, I would try to like reach out to certain people and ask them like, hey, do you remember this? Can you clarify this? And so I did do some interviews as well.
Okay. Yeah, it's incredibly well done, and to tie it in with like the history of the city is a really interesting like perspective to take on that. I know you brought that up earlier in our chat, but like the length of like what a like kind of like great tragic figure to tie Cleveland to. Like as far as like diving into like the architecture, is that something you did via this study, or is that something you were interested in and started to see like similarities too?
The architecture stuff kind of, I worked on this project so long that I kind of changed as a person and my interests grew. And so like what was part of perhaps my original vision for the book was separate from what it ended up being. And I just started trying to think about, place more and like geography, because I'd been started reading more like British writers like Ian Sinclair, who the British have a real knack for tapping into that. And I kind of stole some of the ideas and thinking of these like British writers, because they haven't really been applied to comics, and they definitely have not been applied to Cleveland. So, if you're going to steal from the best.
Right. Well, it was interesting because like reading that, I started to look at the city differently. I was like, oh my God, this is like, you get in your head like with just how the times have changed and how these buildings have been the same. Like halfway through reading this, I went to Max Backs to buy a book on Levy's poetry. And like, I saw that you had in the notes in the back that the poster was still there. And I've seen that poster forever. And like didn't know DA's story, but it's a really interesting like with the Gravity Point or Gravity Falls, like
Gravity Place,
like looking at it in that lens. Like now, is that kind of something that through these British authors that kind of like illuminated to you, or was that something like I guess with that point in particular, how it spreads out and follows the solstices? I guess my question is with that is that something just completely different from this, or is that something you found through influence of these British authors?
Well, the British never, they haven't talked about Cleveland.
Yeah, clearly. But I mean, like, as far as like looking at like this point and seeing how it's built and like, I guess the theological and like philosophical thoughts of map planning or floor plans like that.
City planning. Yeah. How do I answer that? I just started blindly like Googling shit, just like psychogeography Cleveland, ley lines Cleveland, like solstice Cleveland, and just kind of just going on these, just on hunches, just like typing in search words. And this guy, had written something up about gravity plays, and kind of like he's the guy that sort of like discovered, so to speak, that it does in fact align with the solstices. And I was like reading his webpage, and I'm like, he's getting into like the golden ratio and all this shit. And I was like, I just need to meet with this guy and like go to this spot and talk with him. And that kind of got like delayed because there was COVID, and then there was like all the unrest in the city. What year was that? But yeah, so like downtown was just like shut down. So like meeting this guy just kept getting delayed and delayed. But then I went down there with him and stood at the spot, and it's like, oh, even though a lot of the streets are gone and it's changed, you could definitely see when you're standing there that it's a radial design. And he said just by being there, he had a hunch that it lined up with the solstices, and he got old maps and like kind of just started charting it. And he was like, well, son of a bitch, they were doing something here. Now, why did they do it? I don't know, because they didn't actually talk about it in any known historical record. It could have simply been a decorative neoclassical pastiche they were doing. I'm not suggesting that these city founders were like some pagan cult. This isn't I'm not trying to do some sort of like Illuminati Da Vinci Code thing.
Right.
But at the same time, this is there, and it does line up with the solstices, whatever their reasons were. And I just think that's worth meditating on.
For sure. No, like I'm saying, reading this book, like maybe like look at the whole city different. I've lived here for my whole life, and it figures like Peter Laughner and Pere Ubu guys, and just like the kind of like we look at these punk scenes and all this community that's grown elsewhere, and like it's really like, I guess, really inspiring to know that it happens here, right? But then to like backstep that journey and like see all this stuff in a different way, like it's like that's what's so cool about this book is it's not just Peter's story, but it's like all these like twists and turns, like I don't want to say it's like David Thomas philosophy kind of like, but that whole like Cleveland's hot hook into it, like kind of reading that quote and then bouncing back to like this weird layout that it happens to do that. Like it really illuminates that point and makes you like whoa, we were on to something.
Yeah, that particular quote is actually from the local poet Kristen Ban from when she was writing about David Thomas.
Gotcha.
But yeah, a lot of the things David Thomas said and continues to say in his lyrics and interviews and his various kind of indescribable writings actually like are very similar to the psychogeographical writings from England, though I've never heard David Thomas use the term psychogeography specifically. His thinking is very much in that vein, as was D.A. Levy's. And here and there, you would also get it from Peter, though he never like fully articulated it. The thing with Peter is he died so young that he never fully developed.
Yeah.
But who knows what he would have, what path he would have continued down had he lived just only, let's say 2 or 3 years longer. He could have gotten a lot done. But yeah, David Thomas speaks of the city in very kind of romantic and mystical terms, as did Levy. Like Hudson did to a certain point as well. And, these guys are just so quotable. That's why I didn't even need to try to talk to David Thomas. There's so much stuff on the record that I could kind of cherry pick from. Maybe David would be furious about it, but have you talked to David?
Yeah, I got to chat with him. There's no telling with that guy, man. Like,
the thing is, he's got such a notorious reputation for like being a difficult interview, but he also seems to say yes to all interviews.
Yeah, it's interesting.
But he doesn't want to talk about Peter. Like he's been incredibly clear about that. So it's like, I'm just not even going to try. He's made it abundantly. He couldn't make it more clear that he doesn't want to talk about that. So It's like, okay, fair enough. And same with Peter's ex-wife, Charlotte, who I know. She doesn't do interviews. She doesn't want to talk about Peter. But if I ever needed just something kind of like confirmed or clarified, I could occasionally ask her a question.
Okay.
But I could never like really sit down with a tape recorder with her.
Yeah. Well, I got to imagine like like with how manic of a guy he was, that would be kind of a hard thing to revisit for her.
Yes.
But that's cool that it was arm's length, that if you needed direction, that's like, and Dave Thomas, when I talked with him, like he talked with me a little bit. I didn't press it too hard, but like I didn't know the whole like that. I don't know. There was a thing like that was that against it, like, or he was that appalled by it. But he talked to me a little bit about it. I'll send it to you. And like,
Yeah, I'd like to listen to that.
He, for the most part, it was a pretty nice interview. There was one point where he's like, "I'm hungry. Are we done?" I'm like, okay,
incredible. Yeah, I mean, like the man, he respects intelligence, and he just doesn't want to be asked the same questions over and over again.
Sure. Yeah.
And he doesn't like doing, or maybe he does like doing the typical promote the new record or tour thing. I could say he does it. He'd be like, "What are you talking about? I only do records to promote the new tours and records." I don't. He's just. I mean, Lou Reed was difficult too, but but often these difficult guys can be the most interesting.
Oh, for sure. And that's part of why. Like, I think they're difficult, and like in those situations when you're giving someone your time, you kind of want to be. You want to be you don't want to be like, well, I think ice cream is, or whatever, nonsense. You want to really kind of focus in on how, especially with the Pere Ubu album, there's so much like going on in there theoretically or thematically. So like the hone in on why do you guys sound weird, or who knows what, like reporter questions. Yeah. I can see how easy it would be to push those buttons.
Pere Ubu is just such a great band, and I don't even have all their records because they just have such a gigantic, intimidating body of work.
Yeah.
And that's what's so great about them, is that you're not like, okay, I'm done here. There's like always new stuff to check out, especially when you factor in like bootlegs and all the live records. And I'm always hearing new things when I listen to them.
And like how you're saying, like, just because I dove in when I was getting ready to talk with him, I listened to everything, and that was like the most overwhelming experience I've ever done.
Everything? That's like impossible.
Well, I didn't do all the live stuff, but like all the studio albums.
That's still a lot.
I know, and like my brain was not working right. Like, it's so much stuff. But like, and in their website, I saw in the back of the book you quoted, or you pulled from their website, which is super, super in depth, and like.
Yeah, I feel like they changed it around a bit since I was like last like trawling it for information. But I haven't looked at it too closely in a while. But yeah, I mean, yeah, David's just done so many interviews, and kind of like almost releases these manifestos about he's just always like I don't know, like the inter-band dynamics. He's like, well, here's our policies. Like, I don't know why he's letting anybody else know, but yeah, do you have any of his books, like the Book of Hieroglyphs? That's an interesting book.
I don't, but like that one does seem really interesting, especially after reading your book. Like, I didn't get a chance to do that. I went through all the records and my brain was already altered. Like before it was like time to chat with him, and then there's always so much more to dive into. But I haven't. Have you read it?
Yeah, it's a source for sure in the book. Okay. I quote from it.
Yeah, no, I haven't read that one yet, but like I definitely want to. Anyway, I guess on a sideline of that, so like with like as far as like the comic medium, did you start off writing, or did you start off as a writing for a comic medium?
As a younger person, I focused on drawing, and I just kind of like wrote my own stuff, a lot of like gags and like shorter stuff. But I started kind of writing more and more. People would say like, hey, you're a good writer. And at some point I kind of like gave myself permission to start thinking of myself as a writer, and started kind of taking it more seriously, and actually started, with this book, having like a fully formed script that I was typing, as opposed to like working from messy notebooks in longhand and ending up with bad grammar and spelling errors and a multitude of other youthful errors. So does that answer your question?
Yeah. So like when you dove into like this, because this is your first book, but like when did like Stone Church like was that like a product? Was that a byproduct to get this book out, or
not really? Okay. So my friend Jake Kelly and I, Jake's another local artist. We were just kind of, I don't know, shooting the shit, and kind of decided to start a small press. And, I thought it'd be just like a good way to put out our smaller books, like our mini comics and whatnot. And since we had a name and, we're presenting ourselves as a publishing company, that we would occasionally put out smaller books by other people as well. And with the idea, I wanted to, I had an agent in New York and everything. I wanted to sell Ain't It Fun to a larger publisher, and it just wasn't happening. I could have found a smaller publisher, but at that point, we'd kind of worked out some kinks and had Stone Church up and running. And it's like, well, I'm a smaller publisher, so why would I give it to another smaller publisher? Let's just do it ourselves. And we've kind of been learning as we go. And it's we have to do all sorts of shit we don't want to do, like get a fucking accountant and fulfill orders and deal with emails and blah blah blah. But yeah,
well,
it would have been nice. It would have been nice to have some larger publisher write me a check and worry about all that. But they can just then not promote the book or make outrageous editorial demands, and it's just like, fuck it. We can do it exactly the way we want it, and succeed or fail entirely. We have no one to blame but ourselves, or no one to be proud of but ourselves. It's a completely independent effort.
Well, that's what makes it so like DIY punk rock. It's the Ian MacKaye, it's the Peter Laughner. That's what makes it even more badass, is it's coming from the source, And like,
at the same time, we try to, we're not really presenting ourselves as DIY. We're trying to present ourselves as professionals. We hired a professional book designer, Ron Kretsch, who's worked for Smugvale Records. He does a lot of work for Feral House. We got, proper offset printing. We try to do everything legit.
Yeah. Well, no, by no means is the DIY like aesthetic and like, oh, it looks like they stapled to that's not at all what I mean. I like just mean the spirit of it.
I was just clarifying.
Yeah. But yeah, for the listeners.
At what point am I not doing it by myself? It's like, when do I graduate from DIY to whatever? I just kind of, you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I totally know what you mean. Like,
no one's ever going to do it for me.
and part of, I think that's a huge lesson. Like I've learned, like doing music, like all the people you meet and all the bills you play with when you open for the bigger band or whatever. When it comes down to it, it's gonna be you that what I mean. No one, like, they might call you back. Chances are not much, but you know what I mean.
And there's just there's so many things you can't just look up on the internet.
Yeah.
If you Google where to get a book printed or how to sell a book, you'll get a lot of things will come up, but it's all designed to appeal to an individual who's trying to self-publish their self-help book, or their fan fiction dystopia YA novel, and it's just it's all print on demand, and it's just not. It's not real advice. It's advice for amateurs. So it's just all right, well, let me call people I know. It's let me message people I know who run small presses, and know about printers, and know about distributors, and know about shipping, and just get boring, hard facts and advice from people with experience. And more often than not, they're always more than happy to help, because they did the same thing when they were starting out. It's kind of a fraternity of, we pass along this information to each other, and because it's not, there's no other way to get this information.
Right. Well, and that's the whole, kind of going back to D.A. Levy's printing press he did by himself, you know what I mean? Even though that was much more DIY effort, but just there's a spirit, I think, of within Cleveland's make it happen. And even I think you've brought it up multiple times from Peter Laughner's radio interviews about do it yourself.
Yeah.
And And like, even though we're going back, this is reaching out to other people to make it like a, not that aesthetic, but that whole philosophy of making it happen on your own and reaching out and picking up the pen and making it happen, do your own accord is such an impactful thing. And like, I guess like for me, kind of reading through this kind of like really made me feel good that we have that here, you know?
I think it was prescient that Peter said, do it yourself, on the radio. Cause unless I'm mistaken, I don't believe that was like a sort of established slogan or motto, you know? So the fact that he said that and that became such a sort of short manifesto of, you know, I'm not saying that the term caught on because of Peter, not in the slightest. I think it's more of a coincidence.
Yeah.
But it was prescient, and you know, it was very important to me to include that.
No, definitely, because like, well, it shows like how, even though like it wasn't like an established thing or way of thinking or like, but like ahead of the time this dude was like, you know, like bringing all these punk rockers to Cleveland from all these different places, but also like within that thinking. And like, it was also interesting to see like the kind of rise and fall of different musical stylings within him, like to the Bob Dylan phase, then to the, what was his last band? Not the Wolves, Friction. To like the Friction, like in, yeah, but like, to see that kind of wave of an artist, I think it's much more kind of common now. But like a guy who, when he goes through his folk phase, you're like, oh, okay, like,
sure, yeah, but yeah, it was just like in such a short life that he had so many phases, and like, but it wasn't like he had totally abandoned them. Like, there's definitely some of that singer-songwriter folk stuff present in Friction.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I mean, I think, is Friction on the box set?
Yeah.
Okay. Because like it was all on Spotify for a while. Now I got to pick up the vinyl.
Yeah, Friction was definitely one of his major projects, and I would argue that out of the projects he led, which is to say projects without David Thomas, that Friction was his most important and successful. The Friction just had a very unique sound, even though he was kind of like drawing from television. I mean, everyone's drawing from something and has influences. Friction's just got this mood about them.
Like, I don't remember.
Dear Richard.
Okay.
The cover of Calvary Cross. And then there's stuff that hasn't been released. Like, I've got stuff that no one's heard. I don't say that to brag.
Yeah.
It's just like, part of my research, I just tried to find everything I could. And there's a lot of good stuff out there that nobody's heard. I mean, maybe it's like recorded really terribly, but it's still interesting.
Was it? Well, yeah, for sure. And especially when you're weaving this story and you're reading about these times and these places and like these events, and then to kind of get a little bit more of a grasp of it, you know what I mean? Like to like get an actual like something that proves what that was like, or reading a review of it to like put it to life. Was that through kind of talking with people, or was that through like going through like libraries, or like how did you stumble upon those unheard recordings?
Through the grapevine. I mean, you look at like just basically like where the CDR bootlegs were coming from back in the day.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just person.
It was a backdoor deal. Let's just leave it at that.
All right. Okay, perfect. That's awesome. Like, because when I first like listened to his stuff, his acoustic stuff really resonated with me, and I was like reading him and reading about the Wolves and hearing like this punk rock guy, right? And then when I was able to find something that wasn't like, the Pere Ubu or like, because I don't think is the Rocket from the Tombs? Is there any recordings with Peter? It's all the stuff post, right?
No. The recordings are with him.
Oh, okay.
They did when they got back together, they went to the studio and they did proper, so to speak, studio recordings of all the songs with Richard Lloyd on Peter's position.
Right.
But But yeah, there's plenty of recordings of
like live
of
cuts?
Peter with Rocket from the Tombs.
Okay. But like,
He's not singing on all the songs because they were like such a multi-faced group. But yeah, you can get Peter singing Amphetamine, singing Ain't It Fun. There's a lot of stuff.
okay, yeah. But like, what really resonated with me was his like acoustic tracks, and like his songwriting really stuck out and like brought this guy to life for me in a different way. Now, like, so when you were diving in, I guess, into his music, was it like, I would be interested to know your kind of journey with it. Was it through like kind of like diving from Pere Ubu and into tracks like that, or did you like just dive into like this, like, I guess, what was your approach with it?
So yeah, I discovered Pere Ubu when I was like a senior in high school, and I liked them. I liked the early singles, and I remember when I was like 19, I bought their first album, and I'd like listen to it when I was on acid, and I just like thought they were cool. And then Rocket with the Tombs got back together, and I saw them play, and I was like, man, these guys are fucking cool. Oh, when they got back together, I'd never heard of them. I was just like, but they were getting a lot of press. And it was like, oh, this band split off and like created the Dead Boys and Pere Ubu. And I was like, well, that sounds fucking cool. So I went and checked them out, and thought it was great. And then a couple of years later, I was living in Philadelphia, and my friend Gabe sent me a burnt CD of Take the Guitar Player for a Ride, that collection of Peter stuff from the 90s, which was and is very out of print and very expensive. I was like, oh, cool, thanks for sending this to me. And I had this, kind of vague idea in my mind of what it would be. And so I was pretty surprised when I started listening to it, and it was very acoustic, very singer-songwriter. I was almost disappointed. But then I gave it more time, and I kept listening to it. I was like, this is kind of cool. And there is, like, Peter did do some like rowdier, more punk sounding recordings, but like I was just saying, not everything's been heard or released. But poke around on YouTube. There's some stuff on there that like has got very, very few views or listens or whatever, and stuff that's not been released in any other capacity. So there's some obscure gems floating out there for anyone willing to poke around.
Gotta love YouTube.
Yeah, a whole bunch of stuff went up not too long ago. It's just like where the fuck did this come from? Like just like some of his covers and the self-released album Peter did as a teenager.
Yeah.
That's all on YouTube. That's called what's it called? Notes on a Cocktail Napkin. It's not very good.
Yeah.
But it's available.
Right. But also to kind of like hear that, did you find that as well, or is that later like, oh shit, here's this now?
I had a bootleg of it.
Okay, he had a bootleg. Okay. Yeah, that's like, because his journey for me was started there and was completely different from when I was reading. I guess because Adele's book's really good. That was kind of my focal point for understanding, and but
Adele's book is fantastic, but it's a memoir, you know,
of her story,
right, of her story, and she knew Peter like later in his life, and yeah, it's a memoir. I think it's a great piece of writing. I think it's a fantastic book. Well,
definitely that did hook and sinkered me in to the whole narrative.
Yeah, it's I put it up there with like Patti Smith's book.
Yeah.
It's very literary,
I mean, it really made these characters seem real. And I remember buying it from Maxbacks and reading, thinking, oh, is this where they would hang out? This is a bookstore on Coventry. I don't know. But
I think it was Coventry Books, I think might have been where they were hanging out.
Okay. In my mind, I like to think it was there because that's where I got that's where I bought your book.
Well, you could ask Suzanne. She might know.
Yeah.
I don't know when she opened up or if she's always been the owner. I really don't know her that well, but yeah, I was just over there the other day, actually. I signed some of the copies for her.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. It was funny. I bought that book and then I went back the other day to get some of DA's poetry and then stopped in the Big Fun next door or the Big Fun pop-up. I can't remember what they're calling it. But and your books were in there and this lady was telling someone coming through about the Thinker statue right in front of Cleveland or the Cleveland Art Museum and how it, it was bombed and And then I go home and I'm like, I got to read this book. I got to get through it. And then it was on that page. And I was like, whoa. It was a crazy, like, circumstance with that. And that guy, I felt really bad. That guy was like, oh, cool. And I'm like, that's such a sick story. Like, the other thing I found fascinating too was the Robert Lockwood Jr. story. Like I knew he was like related to Robert Johnson, but like
not by blood, but yeah.
But the whole like that was Peter's last recording, and like him stumbling on there, like that's crazy.
With the Robert Johnson on the recording, yeah. I mean, yeah, it's, you know, how can I not talk about that? It's like, well, he records Robert Johnson and he brushed shoulders with a guy with a very direct link to Robert Johnson, you know?
Yeah, it's such a crazy circumstance and predicament. But I sorry if I'm all over the place today. I'm trying to zoom in.
It's an all over the place book.
It is, man. It's so good. Like one other thing I wanted to ask was like, so the initial narrative you said changed. Like initially, what were you kind of planning on this to be?
You know, it was a little more like nihilistic and punk rock. You know, kind of like a little more death tripping.
Okay.
But you know, I hadn't been sober all that long when I started working on it, and I was younger, and you know, let's be honest, my initial interest in Peter Laughner was part of that, you know, that death narrative, you know, that die young thing. I mean, I don't know why that's appealing or romantic. I don't advocate it per se. I'm not gonna like cluck my tongue about it either. And I kind of wanted to explore that. And I like to think I did, but I didn't want to, you know, some of the sort of the nihilistic edges. I was like, do I really want to work on something for years and just kind of say fuck you to people?
Yeah.
Or, you know, maybe I should say a little bit more. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Because it is, I think, like that kind of tragic end or whatever, knowing that a story is capped somewhere, like, it makes it more appealing in a way. Like, I
mean, let's be honest. The only reason people talk about Peter Laughner the way they do is because he died when he did.
Yeah.
It's not to say that doesn't undermine the quality of his work, but there's a lot of good work out there.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of like bands I like or musicians I like that I don't necessarily feel compelled to learn anything about them. I'm just happy to listen to their records. The work, you know, it's good music, it's good work, and that's fine. But there's a story with Peter.
Yeah. There's a starting point and an end point, and like, and it's frantic. Like, you know what I mean? It's chaotic.
But then the story continues after he dies, because it's like, you know, then the Dead Boys record Ain't It Fun, and Rocket for the Tombs gets back together. And, you know, I remember talking to John Morden about it from the Electric Eels when I was working on the book. And I was like, you know, the book doesn't end when Peter dies. There's a whole other part afterwards. And John said, well, good. That's what happened. The rest of us kept living.
Yeah.
So like that way, like you feel you can't end it with his death, because then you don't have that, because that vacancy he left behind and continues to leave behind is part of the story, that the absence. He like remains the main character even after he's gone. And people were really fucked up by Peter dying. They still are, talking to these people. I think it was very, very traumatic for a lot of the people in that scene. It just really fucked them up.
Well, yeah, because it seemed like something that, like, it seemed like everyone was like living this kind of chaotic, all gas, no brakes lifestyle, and like to think, especially at that young an age, you know, I mean, to think that something like that could happen, and like,
it was a cold cup of coffee.
Yeah, and like, it's interesting because it's not like just like. Even though you kind of see it coming with how he was living and like not taking care of himself, and then like not stopping, you know, you see it coming, but like it's not like it didn't seem like I don't know, it's not like a direct. It kind of stumbles as opposed to like just stops, I guess, in a way,
You know,
like
I was
his
looking,
downfall.
For whatever reason, like pictures have been circulating lately of like Shane McGowan in the hospital, and from the Pogues, and he just looks like a fucking mummy.
Yeah,
Like I'm not trying to insult the man,
but no,
but it's like, how the fuck is Shane McGowan still alive? And like Peter Laughner died, at 24. Because it's important to remember that Peter didn't overdose.
Yeah.
Anyone could overdose and die young. With Peter, he just like, we could say he drank himself to death, but there was also a lot of amphetamine use too. And I've heard that amphetamines and alcohol in excess combined are just even worse. I mean, they certainly couldn't be good. But you know what I'm saying? Like, how the fuck is Shane McGowan alive?
Yeah.
Like, did Peter just get unlucky? I don't know. I don't know if we can answer this. It's kind of amazing.
Right. But that's the thing. We can't answer it. But like, I guess that's what I'm trying to articulate. It wasn't like, it was like a slower thing. And like, it is kind of or even a guy like Keith Richards or someone, who's done a shit ton of shit. And you're like, how are these guys holding up? I mean, I guess with him, you can say it's money. But
well, Keith Richards does not look like Shane McGowan, like, I think Keith Richards probably was able to, I'm sure he had his pinnacle of excess and then was able to dial it back. And I mean, Keith Richards seems like a functional person,
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Keith Richards has a reputation for drugs and alcohol, but like, he's not like a fucking hot mess. If someone pays like $150 to see the Rolling Stones, I don't think Keith Richards is like missing his cues and falling down on stage. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like Shane McGowan would get brought out on stage in a fucking wheelchair just because he's such a goddamn mess. The Stones are a functional unit.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. It is, and it's wild that it's only now too with Shane. Cause like I saw that this morning too. I was like,
well, he's been in the hospital before. It was just that particular photo. I mean, I was just like, this guy's. I mean, he looked like death.
Yeah.
And he was such a vibrant young man,
Yeah.
Like, he was such a talent when he was younger. In a way, like, his living is almost more tragic than Peter's dying, to see someone become such a shell of themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe, I guess, because, like, definitely kind of going back to Peter's story, the third part of the book is really when you see that legacy kind of take off and that flower kind of bloom into what it is. And, like, it's interesting because that's a really interesting comparison because for him, it's like living opposite, like to see it decompose. But like, yeah. And one thing I wanted to like reading through the book, I noticed in like a lot of the images, there'd be the word bubbles and the life stinks, have a drink. And then like around the third section, hot, hook in. Like I was a really kind of clear like section change there.
Sometimes I just kind of go with the flow.
Yeah.
And it was like, okay, this is kind of its own section with its own style and its own momentum, like its own movement.
It's a small detail that I kept noticing, but I loved it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes the author's the worst person to ask.
I don't know
if that's a cop out.
No, like it's totally fine to not like, but I thought it was it's a very light little texture change that followed this whole like narrative through. The other part, I really found like it's amazing to me, and I'd be interested to hear kind of your journey through like learning this. Is like reading this book. And like I'd be getting through certain sections and like then showing my girlfriend it and being like, this, how you place all the information on each page and how the characters are drawn, and like it's so emotionally like with DA's death at the end, like that panel you bring it in, not to like spoil it for anyone, but but like how it ends there is such a like that hits so hard, and it's so beautifully drawn in like following this narrative. Like was that like and same with the Kent shootings and just even like getting to the end of the book and to like when Peter passes, like you do an incredible job of emotionally conveying like text-based narrative through these panels and these pictures. And like I guess like as far as like your journey learning how to draw and to take like a narrative that you wrote and like put them together in this way for the first time, like
Sure. I just feel like there's a lot of like, so to me, comics are the interrelationship between image and text. And like, I find it frustrating how little that is often explored. And don't get me wrong, I'm not against doing like a 6 or 9 grid panel like a traditional comic,
yeah.
and that can work for certain storytelling devices. In a more traditional kind of fictional narrative, like an adventure story, or works very well for humor, setting up punchlines and pacing. But this is like the writing here is very narration based, like almost like a quote unquote real book, a traditional book, shall we say. So the layouts kind of take inspiration from Art Nouveau and psychedelic rock posters, which psychedelic rock posters, of course, have their own connection with comics because a lot of the underground comics artists were, in fact, poster artists. So I'm kind of, working in that tradition. But yeah, so like, and there's so much text, I didn't want it just to be the same font and just like in these kind of rectangular caption boxes. I was like, if there's going to be this much text, it has to be part of the composition. It has to be part of the art. It has to be inseparable from it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, definitely. Because like reading it, like there'd be times I'm like, wait, I missed the thing. And I would have to like turn to my book a little bit to see, oh, there's the word. Like it's such a beautiful, like emotional.
It kind of demands you use 2 parts of your brain at once.
Yeah. And like it's I guess what I'm trying to build up to. It's so well done. It emotionally delivers like the heaviness of some of those some of those story narratives, like DA's death and like the Kent shootings, and like it's like I those are heavy topics, and I think you did an amazing job of delivering the seriousness and the emotional impact with your art. And that's and
I think these people are worth honoring, and I didn't want to. I make this clear whenever possible. I was in no way trying to do an authoritative or academic work. It's highly subjective. I'm practically a character, like I'm the narrator. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. These things bother me, and I do think they're emotional, and I wanted to convey that without being exploitative.
Yeah. And I think that's what really hits home, like hits hard about this book, is like those, like it's beautifully done. Like it's I've never read like a narrative like this. Like I've read some graphic novels that like will tell like introduction books. You ever see those little graphic novel books? They'll be like, here's an introduction to Aristotle, and it's all like,
yeah, they're awful.
Yeah. The information's great, but the image is like boring and like, you know what I mean? They're not great to look at, and they're not like, but okay, all right, here's his life. I get it. Like this is like
they're study aids.
Yeah.
And that's fine. I mean, comics are a very good way to convey information. Like, I don't know if the military still does it, but for years the military would just be like, they do a comic on here's how you clean your rifle, or like don't get venereal disease, or like how-to stuff. Like, because you couldn't just watch a YouTube video. So yeah, comics are very good. Comics can do so much. But I feel like, especially in North America, like there's like a rut, and people talk about cliches in relation to like mainstream comics and superhero comics, but I feel like there's just is an entirely different set of cliches in so-called alternative comics, and I'm just like, can we try to do something else here? Can we try to push this a little bit? And don't get me wrong, there is experimental work being done, but it's not being seen by a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, and like, I don't know, in something like, on like this grandeur. Like this is a 444 page book, man. Like this is
It's a beast.
It's a beast. This isn't, and it's like
it could have been longer too. I could have kept going. I was like, especially in part 3, I could have probably done another 100 pages, but I was like, I need to finish this, you know.
Was it had it kept going, can I ask, what would just dive more into?
Okay, so I regret not talking. I mentioned them, but I don't really get into the Styrenes, which was like kind of a band that sort of came out of Mirrors. And I really wish I talked about Mirrors more too. There's just not like a story with Mirrors the way there is with Electric Eels or with Peter's projects. It's just like Mirrors just kind of fell into the background. And then that made it harder to bring up Styrenes. And Styrenes were kind of complicated too. They were like, because they were always like had a different name and like they didn't have like a fixed lineup. It was more like a project than a band. But then later on, Mike Hudson from the Pagans did stuff with Styrenes, which I think is really, really incredible. And nobody's heard it. It's like Mike Hudson was doing like, it's nothing like the Pagans. Mike Hudson's almost doing these like kind of spoken word things, like because Mike was a smart guy and he was a good writer, and he's like sort of telling these stories, and there's almost like this kind of like jazz music behind him. It's kind of beatniky. It's like beatnik noir, and some of it. There's a song called "All the Wrong People Are Dying." It was the B-side of a 12-inch single, so like fucking nobody heard it. Like a 12-inch single from like the 90s. But if you can find this song, All the Wrong People Are Dying, it's a masterpiece. It's just absolutely incredible. And I kind of regret not finding space to talk about that.
Gotcha. Yeah, that sounds, I'm definitely going to look into that. Like,
it's on YouTube.
Yeah. That's
the I don't even know YouTube, if yeah, I forget. I'll see if I can find the link and send it to you.
I'd appreciate it, man. I think like the narrative you take and where it lands and where everything that you pay, there's so much to tip the hat to in this story too, and I think you do a really good job of hitting as much as you can along this narrative. So even if it didn't get there, which would have been really cool to see, I think you did an incredible job of making sure everyone was like at least nodded to.
I also wanted to talk about all the mafia car bombings, but like I did do a page that talks about it, but I cut it because Peter had actually referenced that stuff in one of the longer version of amphetamine, but I don't know. It just didn't like really connect anywhere else. It just kind of like ended up like just seemed like a detour that didn't circle back, and I was like, let's just leave it be. But that is a backdrop. That is an interesting backdrop that it was like when, these early punk bands in Cleveland were operating, Cleveland led the nation in car bombings. I mean, it was like, I think the only place in the world where there were more bombings going on was Northern Ireland.
Oh my God.
And it wasn't just the mafia stuff. And my friend Jake Kelly, my partner, he gets into that because he's doing an ongoing sort of true crime history of Cleveland. So he's kind of obsessed with the various bombings. Like there was one guy going around bombing porno theaters. Then, of course, the Thinker got bombed. I mean, that's a bombing too. So, I mean, bombs were just going off like fucking firecrackers in this town. It was insane.
I was glancing at some of his books, Jake's.
You'd like them. Yeah, you should check them out.
No, I'm definitely going to check them out. I'm planning on picking up a couple. But like, that's fucking crazy. Like, that's... I guess like as far as like the kind of jump off that, how did you and Jake start working together?
I met Jake back when I was still living in Philadelphia. I kind of knew him by reputation, and then I met him at the first Genghis-Con, which is the local like small press comics fest. And I'd see him every year because like I'd come into town for it. And then when I moved back, we just started kind of talking more, and naturally, that's pretty much it.
So, like, who are some of your kind of early like comic guys? Like, who are some of the authors and artists that really like spoke to you to do this as your mode of expression?
Well, as a kid, I read superhero comics and all that. And then when I got into like my 20s, I discovered like underground comics and Dan Klaus, 8 Ball, stuff like that. And that kind of really reignited my interest in comics as a young adult. But yeah, I could ramble about comic book artists I like, till the end of the day.
Was it? Well, that's awesome, man. I really appreciate your time, and like I appreciate you writing this book. Like the message I sent you on Instagram, like when I came across, like this has been bumbling around in my head for a while, like trying to, and clearly not as like I'm not as well adept of a researcher, like, but like I've gotten like kind of pieced together some narratives through talking with like Richard Lloyd and Dave Thomas and like these rockers, and like the Peter's character and story really, really intrigued me. And like I kind of gave up on, I was going to put together like some type of like audio narrative, but I gave up when I couldn't get a hold of Cheetah Chrome. And
I tried to get a hold of him too.
Yeah.
I couldn't. He didn't respond. I didn't try that hard. But he's, I read, some people I didn't need to get a hold of that badly because Cheetah wrote his own autobiography.
Right.
And I was like, okay, I know what he has to say about this. I have access to this. So I didn't really press it.
Yeah.
I mean, if there's people you want to talk to, give me a list and I can see if there's some people I might be able to put you in touch with.
Oh man, I appreciate that. And the other person that kind of like was like, oh, I'll revisit this was I got an email from Richard Hell. Like I was going back and forth.
Yeah, Richard.
He was like, "Did you get a hold of him? Do you have any luck talking with him?"
He told me to go fuck myself.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God. For real? Holy shit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh wow. I wonder when did you? Because like I forget who somehow I found some email and like he was like. He didn't respond. Then I found someone else who was like, I think a PR guy for him or something. And he was like, I appreciate you reaching out, but like I wrote about him in my book. So, and I don't like doing interviews, like was his whole thing.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Some of the stuff in Richard's one book about Peter is really interesting.
Yeah.
Which I think was like for an article he wrote for Spin.
Yeah, it was like Cold and Hot or something like, I can't remember.
That's the name of one of the books. He's got 2 books and he mentions Peter in both of them.
Okay.
The one is like maybe just like sort of like loose diary entries. And the other is like a proper piece he wrote. The thing is that the fucking book doesn't like actually tell you like what each piece was originally published in or when. And I think like Richard is given like the wrong date. I don't know. It's like a little bit confusing. And I've tried to find the actual Spin issue and I like can't. And I don't know why that Spin article isn't viewed as a more major text in relation to Peter because it's got some interesting stuff. Very like what's the word I'm looking for? It's more of a character study. It's not like about like dates and facts about the bands and the recordings. It's more like the impression I got is like Richard came to Cleveland and just talked to people and just like got people's feelings and memories and impressions. So it's almost like a memoir, but secondhand, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's very impressionistic. How accurate is it? I don't know. I mean, that's why I try to give the sources in my own book so people can touch for themselves and, what you can go crazy because I mean, what's true?
That's true. God,
what are we supposed to do? If I'm even to write about my own life or the life of someone I have known my whole life. They could be like, that's not right. I don't remember it that way. I mean, you just have to, all you can do is be honest and have good intentions. I mean, there's more to that. You can't be, you have to be diligent and not be sloppy. But, there's never, let's put it this way. I'm not trying to have the final word on anything. So if anyone else wants to write a bigger and more thorough book about Peter Laughner, I encourage them to do so.
What was it? Well, I also I hope that this like encourages more just interest within it. You know what I mean? Like, and I think it will. And I'm super stoked to be seeing like just popping around the last couple of weeks, seeing your book everywhere. Like, you're definitely
in Cleveland.
Yeah. But
that's
the only place I'm going. But
I mean, we've got it elsewhere too, but it's certainly not as it's not like it's in a couple stores in New York, and it's here and there.
Was it? Well, I hope it just takes over, man, because it's such a good read, and like you did an incredible job with it, and like even if you don't there's enough characters from around every other scene to have an interest within it, and like being from Cleveland, it makes it even cooler. But being somewhere else, I think it would spark your interest into a void as opposed to.
It's not a local interest book, I don't think it is. I think it's, you could live in Wisconsin and read about CBGBs, you know what I mean? Or you can live in California and read about Jack the Ripper in London, just because it's Cleveland doesn't mean you have to live in Cleveland to like it. And you don't have to necessarily even know who Peter Laughner is to enjoy the book,
Yeah, that's what's so cool about it. It's like it trails these two different, there's so many kind of just thought nuggets that are planted through this book that will make you think in different ways on like that. But like you're saying, it follows Peter's narrative, right? But it's also it's punk rock story. It's the DIY story. It's like these murder mysteries at times. It's it's analyzing cities in completely different ways. It's so it's so much it's badass. And so, but yeah, man, thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you so much for taking time to chat with me, and for making this book. This is badass.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And you mentioned the Beachland, so you already know about that, obviously.
Oh yeah, I'm going to be there for sure.
Cool. We'll be at the Grog Shop too. Hold on, let me look at my calendar. Yeah, I don't know what it is. They got a little kind of DIY marketplace thing. I don't know, for Christmas or some bullshit. December 9th, 9 to 4, we'll be at the Grog Shop.
Okay, I'm gonna try to come to that one too, because that would be
I don't think I'll be there. I don't think I'll be there at 9 in the morning, but Jake will. I'll show up at some point.
Okay,
probably around 11 or noon or something.
Yo, Spike Spiegel here. You just listened to Zig At The Gig podcast. Keep riding the bebop. See you, Space Cowboy. Bang.